By the late summer of 1846, the Mexican-American War had already changed shape twice. First, it had been a border crisis, a clash over Texas, the Nueces River, and the Rio Grande. Then it became a battlefield war, with Zachary Taylor's army fighting at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma before occupying Matamoros. But President James K. Polk did not only want to defend Texas. His administration wanted a far larger settlement: New Mexico, California, and a new map of North America. That meant the war could not remain one general's campaign along the Rio Grande. It had to become several campaigns at once. Taylor would push south into northern Mexico. Stephen Watts Kearny would march from Fort Leavenworth toward Santa Fe and then toward California. At sea, American naval commanders would watch the Pacific coast. In California, settlers, naval officers, Mexican officials, and local Californios would be pulled into a struggle whose outcome was still uncertain. To viewers following the war from newspapers, the story could look simple: American armies advancing, Mexican positions falling, manifest destiny becoming real. On the ground, it was not simple at all. It was wagon trains, disease, mountains, deserts, politics, occupation, frightened civilians, ambitious officers, and communities forced to decide how to survive a war moving faster than reliable news. The scale also changed the moral weight of the war. A battle could be explained as a response to an attack, but occupation required a different explanation. Soldiers were no longer only meeting enemy formations. They were entering plazas, raising flags over government buildings, appointing officials, and telling local families that the authority over their lives had changed. The farther the war spread, the more it tested the difference between military success and political legitimacy. Episode 5 follows that expansion. It begins with Taylor's march to Monterrey, then follows the war westward into New Mexico and California. The theme is not one battle, it is scale. In 1846, the war stopped being a single front and became a continental contest. After Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, Taylor held the Rio Grande line. Matamoros was occupied, Fort Texas had been relieved, and American newspapers had found a new hero in Old Rough and Ready. But victory near the river did not end the war. It opened the road into Mexico. Taylor's next target was Monterrey, one of the most important cities in northern Mexico. It sat in a valley framed by the Sierra Madre, guarded by stone buildings, forts, and difficult approaches. The city was not just another dot on a campaign map. It was a political symbol, a supply center, and a gateway toward the Mexican interior. Getting there was its own campaign. Taylor's army moved through heat, mud, disease, dust, and uncertainty. Supplies had to be moved upriver and overland. Wagons broke, animals died. Volunteers learned that war was not only battle, it was waiting, marching, hunger, boredom, fear, and the constant friction of distance. Camargo became a reminder that armies move on logistics before they move on courage. Supplies piled up, transport had to be organized, and illness moved through the camps with quiet force. Taylor's men could celebrate the victories at the Rio Grande, but the advance into Mexico required patience, discipline, and an acceptance that geography might be as stubborn as any enemy. By September, Taylor's army was approaching Monterrey. Regular soldiers marched beside volunteers from Mississippi, Tennessee, Texas, Kentucky, Ohio, and other states. Some still imagined glory. Others had begun to understand that Mexico would not be conquered by one dramatic charge. The volunteer regiments gave Taylor manpower, but they also gave him a command problem. Many volunteers were brave, but bravery did not make them regular soldiers. Discipline, sanitation, marching order, and obedience under fire had to be learned quickly. The army moving toward Monterrey was therefore both stronger and more complicated than the smaller force that had fought on the Rio Grande. Monterrey appeared beneath the mountains like a fortress built into the landscape. Mexican forces under General Pedro de Ampudia prepared to defend it. Ampudia needed to protect a major city, preserve morale after earlier defeats, and turn Monterrey's streets and surrounding heights into a defensive maze. The city offered advantages. Stone buildings could become strongpoints. Narrow streets could break an attack into pieces. Forts and batteries could force the Americans to pay for every approach. The defenses included positions around the city and on the commanding heights. Cerro del Obispado, The hill of the Bishop's Palace watched over the western side. Other works, including Fort Tenaria and nearby batteries, guarded approaches from the east. Monterrey was not an empty battlefield. Civilians lived inside it, and now their homes, churches, plazas, and streets stood between two armies. Taylor divided his plan. General William J. Worth would move against the western approaches and the heights. Taylor would press the eastern side. If both movements succeeded, Ampudia's army could be squeezed inside the city. It was a dangerous plan because it required coordination in difficult ground. Worth had to swing around toward the west, seize key positions, and cut the Saltillo Road. Taylor's men had to fight into the eastern defenses without being swallowed by the city. Ampudia's challenge was just as complicated. Retreat could be seen as weakness. Holding too long could trap his army. Monterrey gave him walls, batteries, and mountains, but it also gave him a civilian population exposed to siege warfare. The Mexican defense had to carry national pride as well as military necessity. Defeat after defeat could damage public confidence, but reckless sacrifice could destroy forces Mexico still needed. Ampudia was defending a city, but he was also defending the idea that Mexico could still resist an invasion that had already crossed from disputed borderland into the republic's northern interior. Worth's movement around Monterrey became one of the most important pieces of the battle. His column moved toward the western side of the city, where the terrain rose into critical heights. If the Americans could capture those heights, they could threaten Monterrey from above and pressure Ampudia's line of retreat. The fighting around Federation Hill and the Bishop's Palace was hard and exposed. Mexican defenders understood the value of the ground. American troops climbed, maneuvered, and fought through difficult slopes under fire. The Bishop's Palace became the visual symbol of the western fight. Its walls stood above the city like a prize and a warning. Capturing it required discipline, courage, and persistence. When Worth's men seized the heights, Monterrey's defense became more fragile. But success in the west did not make the eastern attack easy. On the eastern side, Taylor's men advanced into a brutal lesson. Fort Tenaria and nearby defenses poured fire into the attackers. Streets that looked passable became channels of danger. Buildings offered cover to defenders. The city broke formations apart. The first assaults were costly. American troops pushed forward with courage, but courage did not solve the problem of stone streets under fire. Monterrey punished direct movement. Soldiers learned to move through buildings instead of only along roads. They knocked through walls, fought from house to house, and used rooftops and courtyards to avoid exposed lanes. Mexican defenders fought with determination. Ampudia's men were not simply waiting to collapse. They used the city's structure, fell back from one position to another, and forced the Americans to keep paying for ground. Civilians endured the terror of battle in their own streets. For them, the war was no longer an argument about borders or strategy. It was cannon smoke near homes and soldiers at the door. The American adaptation to house-to-house fighting became one of the battle's most important lessons. Units learned to avoid the deadliest streets by breaking through walls and advancing from room to room. The tactic was practical, but it also revealed the horror of urban war. Homes became passageways, courtyards became firing positions, and private spaces became part of a military machine. For the soldiers, Monterrey compressed fear into corners and doorways. A man could not always see who was firing. Officers could lose track of companies within a few blocks. The city's churches and stone buildings gave the battlefield a strange intimacy. The fighting was close enough for individual courage to matter, but confusing enough that no one fully controlled it. By September 23rd, Ampudia's position had become dangerous. Worth held the western heights. American forces had pushed into the city from the east. Monterrey was under pressure from multiple directions, and continued fighting would bring more destruction. Ampudia asked for terms. Taylor agreed to negotiate. The agreement at Monterrey became one of the most controversial moments of Taylor's campaign. Mexican forces were allowed to evacuate with their arms, and an armistice paused operations for several weeks. To Taylor, the agreement made practical sense. His army had taken losses, his supply line was stretched, and destroying a trapped enemy inside a city was not his only option. A negotiated surrender secured Monterrey without turning the city into a ruin. Taylor also knew that victory could become fragile if it outran supplies. He was not standing in Washington with a map and a headline. He was standing in northern Mexico with tired men, wounded soldiers, exposed communications, and a conquered city that still had to be held. To President Polk and many Americans, the agreement seemed too generous. Polk wanted decisive results, not pauses. He worried that Taylor had let a beaten Mexican army escape. He also worried about Taylor himself. Old Rough and Ready was becoming more famous with every victory, and fame in wartime could become political power. That political tension mattered because Taylor was not a polished party instrument. He was a soldier whose plain style made him appealing to the public and uncomfortable for the administration. Polk wanted generals who won battles, but he did not want a general whose popularity might become independent of the White House. Monterrey therefore became a military victory with a political aftertaste. Monterrey therefore changed two things at once. It proved that American forces could take a fortified Mexican city. It also convinced Polk that the Northern campaign might not be enough. If the war was to force a final peace, Washington might need another route, another army, and another commander. That idea would eventually point toward Winfield Scott and Veracruz. But while Washington thought about Mexico's heartland, the war was already moving west. Far from Taylor's camps, another American army was crossing the plains. Stephen Watts Kearny commanded the Army of the West. His orders were sweeping: occupy New Mexico, then continue toward California. The march from Fort Leavenworth was long, exposed, and psychologically strange. Soldiers moved across distance so vast that the war could feel invisible until they reached the people whose lives it would change. New Mexico was not an empty prize. It was a settled region with Mexican officials, Hispano communities, Pueblo peoples, traders, families, farms, and long-standing local politics. Santa Fe was a capital, not a blank space. Yet Kearny's advance moved with confidence because Mexican resistance in New Mexico was politically and militarily weak at that moment. The Santa Fe Trail had already connected New Mexico to American commerce, and that mattered. Traders, merchants, and local elites understood that power in the region did not come only from flags. It came from roads, markets, credit, animals, supplies, language, and trust. Kearny's army arrived as a military force, but it entered a society already shaped by years of cross-border exchange. Governor Manuel Armijo faced a difficult choice: resist and risk destruction, or withdraw and preserve what could be preserved. In August 1846, Kearny entered Santa Fe without a major battle. The American flag rose over the city, and Kearny declared U.S. authority over New Mexico. A conquest without a major battle can look easy from a distance. For the people of New Mexico, it was still a profound rupture. Allegiance, law, property, taxes, language, and power were suddenly in question. American occupation arrived not only with soldiers, but with proclamations, officials, promises, and uncertainties. Kearny promised protection of property and religion, which was politically wise. He understood that occupation would be easier if it appeared orderly and restrained. But promises did not remove fear. A new government, backed by foreign troops, had arrived almost overnight. Even if there was no large battle in Santa Fe, there was still a conquest. Kearny did not remain long. He organized a new government, left troops behind, and prepared to continue west. But as his column moved toward California, he did not fully understand how unstable California had already become. California in 1846 was a place of distance, rumor, and competing loyalties. It was a Mexican province, but one far from Mexico City. Californios held land, status, and local influence. American settlers had arrived in growing numbers. Foreign merchants and sailors moved through coastal towns. Naval commanders watched from offshore. Everyone understood that California mattered, but not everyone agreed on what future should follow. In June 1846, before formal news of war had fully clarified events on the Pacific coast, a group of American settlers in Northern California seized Sonoma and raised the Bear Flag. The Bear Flag revolt was messy, improvised, and full of local ambition. John C. Fremont, already a figure of exploration and expansion, became associated with the movement and with the wider American push in California. The revolt did not represent all Californians. Many Californios viewed the newcomers with suspicion or anger. Others tried to read the political winds and protect their families and property. Like so much of the Mexican-American War, events moved through local realities rather than clean national lines. Fremont's presence made events even more volatile. To some Americans, he was an explorer and symbol of westward expansion. To Mexican officials and many Californios, he looked like the advance edge of an American takeover. His exact intentions and the timing of his actions would be debated, but the practical result was clear. California's political balance was breaking down before regular military authority fully arrived. Then the U.S. Navy acted. Commodore John D. Sloat, commanding the Pacific Squadron, moved to seize Monterrey on the California coast in July 1846. Soon American flags flew over key ports. Robert F. Stockton arrived and took a more aggressive role. Los Angeles, San Diego, and other places became part of a fast-moving contest. From Washington's perspective, California was a strategic prize. From California's towns and ranchos, it was a lived crisis. Uncertain authority, shifting flags, armed strangers, and the question of who would govern when the dust settled. The naval campaign also showed how different the Pacific War was from Taylor's campaign. There were ships, ports, proclamations, marines, sailors, settlers, and local militias. Control could appear suddenly on the coast, but inland authority was thinner. A harbor could be occupied before the surrounding society accepted the occupation. American occupation in the West did not end resistance. In New Mexico, the apparent ease of Kearny's entry hid deep resentment that would later erupt. In California, U.S. control proved uneven. Some towns changed hands with little immediate fighting, but local opposition remained powerful. Californios were not simply passive observers. Leaders such as José María Flores and Andrés Pico would soon help organize resistance in Southern California. California resistance exposed a weakness in the American assumption that flags settled facts. Many local families had their own loyalties, grievances, and leaders. They knew the terrain better than the occupying forces. They could move through ranchos, towns, and passes with a confidence outsiders lacked. The struggle for California was therefore not only a naval story or a settler story. It was also a local war over authority, honor, and survival. The American war effort now had a new problem. Conquest and control were different things. Taking a capital or a port did not automatically secure the countryside. Raising a flag did not settle loyalty. Proclaiming authority did not erase local power. This mattered because Polk's war aims required more than battlefield victories. If the United States wanted territory, it had to hold territory long enough to bargain from strength. That meant garrisons, supply lines, political agreements, local collaborators, and the management of anger. The same problem existed in New Mexico. Santa Fe had fallen without a major battle, but the absence of battle was not the same as consent. American officers had to rely on local cooperation while also preparing for the possibility that cooperation could collapse. The occupation state was fragile, improvised, and dependent on the behavior of soldiers who did not always understand the communities around them. Taylor had discovered at Monterrey that even victory could create political trouble. Kearny and the naval commanders in California would discover that occupation brought its own dangers. The war was spreading, but so were its complications. By the end of 1846, the United States appeared to be winning. Taylor held Monterrey. Kearny had entered Santa Fe. American naval forces had seized important California ports. Fremont and other American actors had helped push events in Northern California toward U.S. control. On paper, the momentum looked enormous. But the war was not finished. Mexico had not accepted defeat. Northern cities could fall, western provinces could be occupied, and still the Mexican government could refuse the peace Polk wanted. The United States could win battles and still face the question that had been growing since the war began. How far would it have to go? Monterrey had shown the cost of city fighting. New Mexico had shown that occupation could arrive faster than legitimacy. California had shown that local politics could turn a distant war into a scramble of settlers, sailors, commanders, and Californios. The war's geography now forced Americans to think in multiple directions at once. Taylor's army faced the possibility of another Mexican army in the north. Kearny was moving toward a California situation that was changing by the week. Naval officers were trying to secure ports while political authority remained uncertain. Polk, watching from Washington, had to convert scattered victories into a peace settlement Mexico still refused to grant. Polk increasingly looked toward a decisive strike. The road through northern Mexico was long and politically complicated. The Gulf Coast offered another possibility: land an army at Veracruz and march toward Mexico City. That campaign would require the Army's senior general, Winfield Scott, and it would become one of the most dramatic operations in American military history. Episode 5 reaches the moment when the war is no longer confined to one front. It now stretches from Monterrey's stone streets to Santa Fe's plaza, from Sonoma's bare flag to California's harbors, and from Polk's cabinet room to the coming invasion route at Veracruz. But this final episode does not stop there. The war has widened too much to be understood in fragments. To see how it ended, we have to follow the remaining campaigns together. Santa Anna's return, Taylor's desperate stand at Buena Vista, Winfield Scott's landing at Veracruz, the march inland, the battles before Mexico City, and the treaty that redrew the map. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna returned to Mexican politics and command at a moment of national crisis. He was one of the most complicated figures in the history of the war. Charismatic, ambitious, ruthless when necessary, and able to present himself as indispensable even after earlier disasters. To many Mexicans, he represented both hope and frustration. He had lost, returned, promised recovery, and returned again. In 1846 and 1847, he would try to turn American momentum into a Mexican revival. Santa Anna understood that Taylor's Northern Army had become exposed. Polk and Washington were shifting attention toward Winfield Scott's planned expedition against Veracruz. Some of Taylor's best regular troops were reassigned to Scott. That left Taylor with a reduced force in northern Mexico, including many volunteers who had courage but uneven training. Santa Anna saw an opportunity. If he could crush Taylor, Mexico could restore morale, embarrass the United States, and perhaps force a different political conversation. The Northern Front might become the place where American confidence broke. Taylor moved south from Monterrey toward Saltillo and then to a defensive position near Buena Vista, close to the hacienda of Angostura. The ground mattered. The road passed through narrow terrain shaped by ravines and ridges. A smaller army could use the landscape to resist a larger one. Taylor's men would need every advantage the ground could give them. Santa Anna's army endured a brutal march across harsh country. Hunger, thirst, exhaustion, and desertion weakened it before the battle began. Yet it remained large and dangerous, and its approach carried psychological force. For Taylor's soldiers, the question became simple and frightening. Could a reduced American army hold against Santa Anna himself? The Battle of Buena Vista began as a test of nerve. Santa Anna demanded surrender. Taylor refused. The Mexican army attacked across difficult ground, probing the American line, pressing weak points, and trying to turn position into panic. The battlefield was broken and confusing. Ravines split the terrain, units shifted under pressure. Officers had to make decisions in smoke, dust, and uncertainty. American artillery became crucial. Batteries under officers such as Braxton Bragg fired with speed and discipline, helping hold the line when infantry wavered. Volunteer regiments fought fiercely, but some formations were tested almost beyond endurance. Men who had marched with patriotic confidence now faced the terror of a battlefield where survival depended on discipline they had only recently learned. Mexican attacks came with determination. Santa Anna's soldiers were not an abstract mass. They were men fighting for a country already invaded, struggling through exhaustion and command confusion, and trying to reverse the war's direction. At moments, the American line bent badly. The outcome was not obvious. Buena Vista could have become the defeat Polk feared. Taylor's public image grew from the battle because he seemed unshaken under pressure. The story that reached American newspapers emphasized his plain courage, his refusal to retreat, and the dramatic endurance of a smaller army against a larger force. Whether every detail of the legend was tidy or not, the political effect was real. Taylor emerged as an even larger national figure. Santa Anna eventually withdrew. The battle was costly and ambiguous in some military details, but politically it became an American victory. Taylor had survived the greatest threat to his northern army. Mexico had failed to destroy him, and yet Buena Vista did not end the war. The decisive campaign was already shifting to the Gulf Coast. Winfield Scott's campaign began with an operation unlike anything the United States had attempted on that scale. Veracruz was Mexico's major Gulf port and the gateway to the historic road inland toward Mexico City. To take it, Scott needed ships, landing craft, artillery, engineers, regular soldiers, volunteers, coordination, patience, and nerve. The landing in March 1847 brought thousands of American troops ashore near Veracruz in a carefully organized amphibious movement. The scale mattered. This was no frontier skirmish and no improvised occupation. It was a formal invasion aimed at the heart of Mexico. Scott, often vain and difficult, was also a serious professional soldier. He understood that the campaign required discipline, supply, and careful staging. A reckless landing could fail before the army even reached the walls. Veracruz was defended by fortifications, including the powerful castle of San Juan de Ulua offshore. Scott chose siege rather than immediate storm. American artillery and naval guns battered the city. The bombardment created military pressure and civilian suffering. Families inside Veracruz faced fear, destruction, and uncertainty as shells struck a city that was both fortress and home. The surrender of Veracruz gave Scott the base he needed, but it also reminded everyone that the war's final phase would be harder morally and politically. The United States was no longer simply occupying distant northern provinces. It was invading through the central route toward Mexico's capital. Scott had to move quickly because disease on the coast could destroy an army as surely as battle. Yellow fever season threatened. The road inland had to be opened before sickness trapped the expedition near the port. The next major obstacle was Santa Anna at Cerro Gordo. Santa Anna chose strong ground at Cerro Gordo, where the road inland passed through difficult terrain. The Mexican position looked formidable. Heights, ravines, and artillery could punish a frontal attack. But Scott's army included engineers and officers who studied the terrain carefully. Among them was Robert E. Lee, then a young engineer whose reconnaissance helped identify a way around the strongest Mexican position. The American plan used maneuver as much as force. Instead of simply battering the center, Scott's troops worked through difficult paths to outflank the defenses. The fighting was sharp and dangerous, but the result was decisive. Mexican positions collapsed, guns were captured, and Santa Anna barely escaped. In the confusion, even his personal carriage and possessions became trophies of war. Cerro Gordo opened the road inland. It also confirmed that Scott's campaign had a different character from Taylor's. Taylor had become the people's frontier general, plain-spoken and stubborn. Scott moved with a professional army along a classic invasion route, using engineers, siegecraft, logistics, and disciplined maneuver. For Mexico, Cerro Gordo was another blow after another rally. Santa Anna could still command political loyalty and military energy, but each defeat narrowed his room to maneuver. The road to the capital was not open in a simple sense, but the barrier had been broken. Scott entered Puebla in May 1847. There he paused. Supply lines, reinforcements, diplomacy, disease, and politics all mattered. An army could win battles and still be stranded if it could not sustain itself. For weeks, the campaign became a test of patience. When Scott resumed the advance toward Mexico City, the campaign entered a dramatic final geography. The Valley of Mexico carried enormous symbolic weight. Mexico City was not merely an administrative target. It was the capital, the political center, and a place layered with Mexican history, Spanish colonial power, and the memory of Tenochtitlan. For an American army to approach it was to bring the war into the heart of the nation. Scott faced defensive positions south and west of the city. The battles of Contreras and Churubusco came in August 1847. At Contreras, American forces used night movement and difficult ground to strike effectively. At Churubusco, Mexican defenders fought hard around convent walls and fortified positions. The fighting was intense, close, and costly. The San Patricio Battalion added another layer to the story. Composed largely of Irish and other immigrant soldiers who had deserted from the U.S. Army and fought for Mexico, They became symbols of betrayal to Americans and symbols of conscience or solidarity to some Mexicans. Their fate after capture was harsh and controversial, showing how the war strained ideas of loyalty, religion, identity, and punishment. After Churubusco, peace negotiations flickered but did not end the war. Nicholas Trist, sent by Polk to negotiate, found himself working in the shadow of battle, occupation, and political mistrust. Mexico could not easily accept the loss Polk demanded. The United States could not easily stop after paying such a cost. The campaign therefore continued toward the final defenses of Mexico City. In September 1847, the fighting reached Chapultepec. Chapultepec Castle stood on a hill, guarding approaches to the capital. It was a military objective, but it also became a symbol of national memory. Mexican cadets, later remembered as the Niños Heroes, became part of the story of sacrifice and resistance. The exact legends would grow over time, but the emotional truth was clear. The defense of Chapultepec became one of Mexico's enduring memories of the war. Scott's army attacked after preparatory bombardment. American troops climbed slopes, stormed defenses, and pushed toward the gates of Mexico City. The fighting was fierce and costly. Officers who would later become famous in the American Civil War served in this campaign. Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, George McClellan, Thomas Jackson, and many others. In Mexico, they learned lessons of maneuver, artillery, engineering, command, and war's political consequences. Once Chapultepec fell, American troops advanced toward the city gates. Mexico City could not be held much longer. Santa Anna's position became untenable. The capital fell to U.S. occupation in September 1847. The occupation of Mexico City was a stunning military achievement and a profound humiliation for Mexico. American soldiers entered the capital of a neighboring republic. Flags, patrols, orders, and occupation authorities replaced Mexican control in the heart of the country. Yet even then, victory did not answer every question. What peace would be imposed? How much territory would the United States demand? Would Mexico's government survive enough to sign a treaty? And what would conquest do to the United States itself? The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in February 1848. Mexico recognized the Rio Grande as the Texas border and ceded a vast territory to the United States, California, New Mexico, and lands that would become parts of Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. In exchange, the United States paid Mexico and assumed certain claims. On paper, it was a treaty. In lived reality, it was a continental transformation. For the United States, the treaty seemed to fulfill an expansionist vision. The nation now stretched to the Pacific. Ports, mineral wealth, farmland, trade routes, and strategic depth entered American imagination. The discovery of gold in California would soon accelerate migration and make the consequences even more explosive. For Mexico, the loss was devastating. A huge portion of national territory was gone. The war left political wounds, economic strain, military humiliation, and deep questions about leadership and national survival. Mexican memory of the war would not be the same as American memory. One side often remembered victory and destiny. The other remembered invasion and loss. For people living in the ceded territories, the treaty created immediate uncertainty. Mexican citizens were promised rights, property protections, and choices about citizenship. But promises on paper did not always survive local prejudice, legal pressure, language barriers, and new power structures. Californios, Nuevo Mexicanos, indigenous nations, and many communities in the borderlands faced a future shaped by laws and migrants moving faster than justice. The war also intensified the argument over slavery. New territory forced the United States to ask whether slavery would expand westward. The Wilmot Proviso had already revealed the danger. The Compromise of 1850 would try to contain the crisis, but the Mexican Cession helped push the United States toward the sectional conflict that became the Civil War. In that sense, the Mexican-American War did not simply end in 1848. Its consequences kept moving. The treaty also created a problem of memory. In the United States, many people folded the war into a triumphal story of expansion, bravery, and continental destiny. There were critics, including Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant in later reflection, and anti-war voices who believed the conflict had been provoked for territory. but the popular memory often favored the drama of victory. Taylor at Buena Vista, Scott at Mexico City, and the flag reaching the Pacific. In Mexico, memory worked differently. The war became a wound, a warning, and a political accusation. It exposed divisions within Mexico's government, weaknesses in the army, the danger of regional disunity, and the crushing reality of a stronger neighbor. It also created stories of resistance that remained powerful. Defenders at Churubusco, soldiers at Chapultepec, civilians enduring siege and occupation, and leaders trying to save what could be saved after catastrophe. The borderlands carried both memories at once. A family in New Mexico, California, or what would become Arizona might have lived under Mexico one year and the United States the next, without ever moving from home. Land titles, courts, languages, taxes, churches, trade routes, and family networks all had to adjust to a new national order. Some people adapted and prospered. Others lost land, status, legal protection, or political voice. The war also changed the United States Army. It proved that the Army could conduct long campaigns far from its bases, coordinate with the Navy, use engineers effectively, and sustain an expedition from the coast to an enemy capital. But it also revealed the limits of volunteer discipline, the danger of disease, and the moral difficulty of occupation. The officers who studied those lessons would carry them into the 1850s and then into the Civil War. For indigenous nations, the result was not liberation or stability. The transfer of sovereignty often meant a new wave of American expansion, military pressure, land hunger, and broken promises. The map changed hands in diplomatic language, but many native communities had never consented to Mexican authority or American authority in the first place. The treaty settled a war between governments while leaving deeper struggles over land and sovereignty unresolved. That is why the ending of the Mexican-American War feels less like a door closing than a door opening into several harder stories. The United States gained territory, but also gained new conflicts over slavery, citizenship, race, law, and expansion. Mexico lost territory, but also entered a long effort to recover political stability and national confidence. The people of the ceded lands inherited a border that would shape identity for generations. The Mexican-American War remade North America, but it did not settle North America. It made Zachary Taylor a national hero and soon a president. It gave Winfield Scott one of the most brilliant campaigns in American military history. It trained a generation of officers who would later face each other under different flags. It expanded the United States to the Pacific and transformed California from distant province to explosive center of migration, gold, and statehood. It also exposed the violence inside expansion. The language of destiny could make conquest sound inevitable, but nothing about the war was inevitable to the people who endured it. Mexican soldiers fought, civilians suffered. Local communities negotiated survival. Indigenous nations faced new pressures from a growing United States. Former Mexican citizens in the ceded territories learned that a treaty could promise protection without guaranteeing equality. The war's legacy is therefore double. It is a story of military audacity, political ambition, and strategic success. It is also a story of invasion, occupation, displacement, and consequences that reached far beyond the battlefield. From Monterrey's streets to Buena Vista's ravines, from Veracruz's walls to Chapultepec's hill, from Santa Fe's plaza to California's harbors, the war forced an entire continent into motion. It redrew borders, created heroes, deepened wounds, and set loose arguments that would shape the next generation. This is why the Mexican-American War matters. It was not a small war on the way to bigger stories. It was one of the bigger stories, the hinge between the early republic and the continental United States, between expansion and civil conflict, between maps drawn in capitals and lives changed on the ground. And by the time the guns fell silent, the continent had become something different from what it had been when the first shots were fired near the Rio Grande. The final measure of the war is not only the land transferred or the battles won. It is the way the conflict forced every group involved to live with a new reality. American expansionists saw a dream fulfilled. Mexican families saw a national disaster. Soldiers carried memories of courage, fear, disease, boredom, and loss. Politicians inherited arguments they could not control. Borderland communities learned that flags could change faster than justice. The Mexican-American War was therefore not just the story of how one country defeated another. It was the story of how power moves across a map and then settles into homes, courts, farms, towns, ports, mines, and memories. Its ending created the American West as many later generations would imagine it, but it also created wounds and questions that never fully disappeared. That is the full arc of this series, from Texas and the Rio Grande, through the first battles, through Monterrey and the western provinces, through Buena Vista and Veracruz, all the way to Mexico City and the treaty table. A war that began with a border dispute ended by transforming the continent.